Welcome to New American Mythos, where old stories are kindled like firelight, and we gather round to remember the tales that shaped us. Tonight we leave the haunted towns of New England and step deeper into the woods, to the mossy swamps and shadowed clearings of colonial Massachusetts. It is here, just outside Boston, that Washington Irving, in the early 1800s, imagined a tale about greed, deals, and damnation. Irving, the same author who gave us Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow, turned from legend to parable, warning of the costs of American ambition. He wrote this in a republic still young, but already shifting from sacred bonds to shrewd arrangements. This is The Devil and Tom Walker, a story not about violence, but about bargains, not about heroes, but about trades. So, lean in close and listen as a man wanders into the woods and finds a devil with a ledger. And the real question here isn't whether he'll make a deal, it's how many of us already have. In a land that once valued relationships, but now traffics in contracts and credit, Irving asks a question that still echoes. What do we trade for success? And who, if anyone, owns our soul in a world built on deals? Let's begin. The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving. A few miles from Boston, in Massachusetts, there is a deep inlet winding several miles into the interior of the country from Charles Bay, and ending in a thickly wooded swamp or morass. On one side of this inlet is a beautiful dark grove. On the opposite side, the land rises abruptly from the water's edge into a high ridge, on which grow a few scattered oaks of great age and immense size. Under one of these gigantic trees, according to old stories, a great amount of treasure was buried by Kidd the pirate. The inlet made it easy to bring the money in by boat, secretly and at night, to the very foot of the hill. The height of the place allowed a good lookout to be kept, so no one could approach unnoticed. And the remarkable trees served as clear landmarks by which the spot might easily be found again. The old stories add, moreover, that the devil himself provided over the hiding of the money and took it under his guardianship. But this, it is well known, he always does with buried treasure, particularly when it has been ill-gotten. Be that as it may, Kidd never returned to recover his wealth, being shortly afterward seized at Boston, sent to England, and there hanged for a pirate. Around the year 1727, just at the time when earthquakes were common in New England and shook many tall sinners down upon their knees, there lived near this place a meager, miserly fellow named Tom Walker. A quick side note here. The word miser means a wretched man who clings to money and tries to do everything possible to get it. Tom had a wife as miserly as himself. They were so miserly that they even conspired to cheat one another. Whatever the woman could lay hands on, she hid away. A hen could not cackle, but she was alert to secure the new-laid egg. Her husband was constantly prying about, trying to uncover her secret hoards, and many fierce quarrels took place over what ought to have been shared property between them. They lived in a forlorn-looking house that stood alone and had an air of starvation. A few straggling savin trees, emblems of sterility, grew nearby. No smoke ever curled from its chimney, no traveler stopped at its door. A miserable horse, whose ribs were as visible as the bars of a gridiron, stalked about a field where a thin carpet of moss barely covered the ragged beds of pudding stone, tantalizing and mocking his hunger. Sometimes he would lean his head over the fence, looking pitifully at passers-by, and seemed to beg for deliverance from this land of famine. The house and its inhabitants had a bad reputation altogether. Tom's wife was a tall, shrewish woman, fierce of temper, loud of tongue, and strong of arm. Her voice was often heard in verbal warfare with her husband, and his face sometimes bore marks showing that their conflicts were not limited to words. No one, however, dared interfere. The lonely traveler would shrink within himself at the horrid clamor and scratching scuffle, glance askance at the den of discord, and hasten on his way, rejoicing, if a bachelor, in his celibacy. One day, after Tom Walker had been to a distant part of the neighborhood, he took what he thought was a shortcut home through the swamp. Like most shortcuts, it was poorly chosen. The swamp was thickly grown with great gloomy pines and hemlocks, some rising nearly 90 feet high, which made it dark even at noonday and a haunt for all the owls in the area. It was full of pits and quagmires, partly covered with weeds and moss, where the green surface often lured travelers into gulfs of black, smothering mud. There were also dark and stagnant pools, the homes of the tadpole, the bullfrog, and the water snake, where the trunks of pines and hemlocks lay, half drowned and half rotting, looking like alligators asleep in the mire. Tom had been cautiously making his way through this treacherous forest, stepping from tuft to tuft of rushes and roots that gave precarious footing among deep bogs, or moving carefully like a cat along the fallen trunks of trees, startled now and then by the sudden screech of the bittern or the flapping of a wild duck rising from some lonely pool. At length, he reached a firm piece of ground that jutted out like a peninsula into the deep heart of the swamp. It had been one of the Indian strongholds during their wars with the first colonists. Here they had built a kind of fort, which they considered nearly impregnable, and used it as a refuge for their women and children. Nothing remained of the old fort but a few embankments, slowly sinking to the level of the surrounding earth, already partly overgrown by oaks and other forest trees, their foliage a bright contrast to the dark pines and hemlocks of the swamp. It was late in the dusk of evening when Tom Walker reached the old fort, and he paused there to rest. Anyone else would have been unwilling to linger in such a lonely, melancholy place, for common folk had long held it in bad repute, due to the stories passed down from the Indian wars, tales that claimed that the savages had held incantations there and made sacrifices to the evil spirit. Tom Walker, however, was not the kind of man to be troubled by such fears. He rested for a while on the trunk of a fallen hemlock, listening to the ominous cry of the tree toad and poking with his walking stick into a mound of black earth at his feet. As he unconsciously turned up the soil, his staff struck something hard. He raked it out of the earth, and lo, a split skull with an Indian tomahawk buried deep in it lay before him. The rust on the weapon showed how long it had been since this death blow had been struck. It was a grim reminder of the fierce struggle that had once taken place in this last stronghold of Indian warriors. "Humph," said Tom Walker, giving it a kick to shake off the dirt. "Let that skull alone," said a gruff voice. Tom looked up and beheld a great black man seated directly across from him on the stump of a tree. He was exceedingly surprised, having heard or seen no one approach. He was even more perplexed to see, as far as the growing gloom would allow, that the stranger was neither Negro nor Indian. True, he wore a rough Indian outfit with a red sash wrapped around his body, but his face was neither black nor copper-colored. Rather, it was swarthy, dingy, and blackened with soot, as if he were used to laboring among fires and forges. His coarse black hair stood out in all directions, and he carried an axe on his shoulder. He glared for a moment at Tom with a pair of large red eyes. "What are you doing on my grounds?" growled the black man. "Your grounds?" said Tom with a sneer. "They're no more yours than mine. They belong to Deacon Peabody." "Deacon Peabody be damned," said the stranger, "as I flatter myself he will be, if he doesn't look more to his own sins and less to those of his neighbors. Look yonder and see how Deacon Peabody is faring." Tom looked in the direction the stranger pointed and saw one of the great trees, fair and flourishing on the outside, but rotten at the core. It had been nearly cut through, so that the first strong wind was likely to bring it down. Carved into the bark was the name Deacon Peabody, an eminent man who had grown wealthy by driving shrewd bargains with the Indians. Looking around, Tom found that most of the tall trees were marked with the names of some great man of the colony, all more or less notched by the axe. The one he had been sitting on, which had clearly just been felled, bore the name Crowninshield, and Tom recalled a very rich man by that name, notorious for his vulgar display of wealth, which rumor said he had acquired through buccaneering, which means pirating. "He's just ready for burning," said the black man with a growl of triumph. "As you see, I'm likely to have a good stock of firewood for the winter." "But what right have you," asked Tom, "to cut down Deacon Peabody's timber?" "The right of a prior claim," replied the other. "This woodland belonged to me long before one of your pale-faced race set foot on the soil." "And pray, who are you, if I may be so bold?" asked Tom. "Oh, I go by various names. In some countries I am the Wild Huntsman, in others the Black Miner. In this neighborhood, I'm known as the Black Woodsman. I am he to whom the red men consecrated this place, and in whose honor they now and then roasted a white man as a sweet-smelling sacrifice. Since the red men were exterminated by you white savages, I now pass the time presiding over the persecution of Quakers and Anabaptists. I am the great patron and instigator of slave dealers and the Grand Master of the Salem witches." "Well, the upshot of all that, if I'm not mistaken," Tom said boldly, "is that you are he commonly called Old Scratch." "The same, and at your service," replied the black man with a half-civil nod. Such, according to the old story, was the beginning of their interview, though it sounds almost too familiar to be believed. One might expect that encountering such a strange figure in that wild, lonely place would shake any man's nerves. But Tom was a hard-headed fellow, not easily frightened. Having lived so long with a shrewish wife, he had ceased even to fear the devil. Let's take a step back here. There is something ancient about a deal struck in the woods. In the shadow of trees older than any man, temptation seems more honest. There's no fine print, just a voice, a price, and the pause that comes before a decision. But what makes Tom's tale so American isn't the presence of the devil, it's that he hesitates. In a world shaped by contracts and ledgers, by property and paper, we often imagine ourselves as rational actors, weighing gains and losses and negotiating with fate. And yet behind every bargain, there lies a silence we ignore. What kind of man makes a deal with the devil? And what does it say that so many names are already carved into the other trees? Irving wrote in A New Republic, whose ideals were freshly inked, and yet in many ways it was already uneasy about how quickly covenants could be replaced by arrangements. The wilderness had become a place not of refuge, but of risk and return. The devil doesn't chase anyone here. He simply waits. And perhaps the most frightening part is that so many come to him willingly. Let's return to the story. It is said that after this, they had a long and serious conversation as Tom made his way home. The black man told him of vast sums of money buried by Kid the Pirate under the oak trees on the high ridge near the swamp. All of this treasure was under his control and protected by his power, so that no one could find it unless they won his favor. These riches he offered to place within Tom Walker's reach, having taken a particular liking to him, but only on certain conditions. What those conditions were can easily be guessed, though Tom never revealed them publicly. They must have been severe, for he asked for time to consider them, and Tom was not a man to hesitate when money was involved. When they reached the edge of the swamp, the stranger stopped. "What proof have I that all you've said is true?" asked Tom. "There's my signature," replied the black man, pressing his finger to Tom's forehead. With that, he turned and moved off into the swamp. According to Tom, he went down, down, down into the earth, until only his head and shoulders were visible. Then he disappeared completely. When Tom got home, he found the black imprint of a finger burned, as if seared, into his forehead. Nothing could erase it. The first news that his wife had to share was the sudden death of Absalom Crowninshield, the rich buccaneer. It was reported in the newspapers with the usual flourish. "A great man has fallen in Israel." Tom remembered the tree that had just been hewn down by his black acquaintance, which was ready for burning. "Let the freebooter roast," said Tom. "Who cares?" Now, fully convinced that everything he had heard and seen was real, Tom began to reconsider the stranger's offer. Though he rarely confided in his wife, the secret disturbed him enough that he shared it. At the mention of the hidden gold, all her greed was awakened. She urged Tom to accept the black man's term and secure a fortune that would make them rich for life. Tom may have been willing to sell himself to the devil, but not to please his wife. So he flatly refused, purely out of spite. Their arguments over the matter were many and bitter. But the more she insisted, the more determined Tom was not to be damned just to satisfy her. Eventually, she resolved to strike the bargain herself and to keep the whole reward. Fearless like her husband, she set out toward the old Indian fort one summer evening. She was gone for many hours. When she returned, she was tight-lipped and sullen. She said something about a black man whom she had found hewing at the root of a tall tree, but he had been surly and would not strike a bargain with her. She was to return with a proprietary offering, but did not say what it was. The next evening she set off again for the swamp, her apron heavily laden. Tom waited and waited, but she never came back. Midnight passed, morning, noon, night came and went, but still no wife. Tom began to worry, especially when he discovered that she had taken the silver teapot and spoons and every other portable article of value with her. Another night passed, and another day, and still no sign of her. In short, she was never heard from again. No one knows what truly happened to her, though many claimed to know. Some said she got lost in the tangled swamp and sank into a pit. Others, less charitable, suggested she ran off with the valuables to another province. Still others guessed that the tempter had lured her into a dismal quagmire, on top of which her hat was later found. Supporting this version, it was said that a great black man with an axe on his shoulder was seen leaving the swamp that very night, carrying a bundle tied in a checkered apron, with a look of surly triumph. The most common and likely story, however, says that Tom Walker grew so anxious about the fate of his wife and his property that he finally went searching for both at the Indian fort. One long summer afternoon, he wandered through the gloomy place, calling her name, but to no avail. The bittern alone answered his call with its shriek, and the bullfrog croaked sadly from a nearby pool. At last, in the dim twilight hour, when owls began to hoot and bats took wing, Tom's attention was drawn to the cries of carrion crows circling a cypress tree. He looked up and saw a bundle tied in a checkered apron hanging from the branches, with a great vulture perched nearby as if standing guard. Tom leapt for joy, recognizing the apron, thinking it must contain the stolen household goods. "Let us get hold of the property," he said consolingly to himself, "and we'll try to do without the woman." As he scrambled up the tree, the vulture spread its wide wings and sailed off, screaming, into the deep shadows of the forest. Tom seized the checkered apron, but, woeful sight, found nothing inside except a heart and a liver. Such, according to this most authentic old story, was all that remained of Tom's wife. She had likely tried to deal with the black man as she was used to dealing with her husband, but though a female scold is generally considered a match for the devil, in this case she seemed to have come off the worse. Still, she must have died fighting, for it's said that Tom noticed many prints of cloven feet stamped deeply into the ground about the tree, and found tufts of hair that looked as if they'd been torn from the coarse black mane of the woodsman. Tom, who knew his wife's strength firsthand, shrugged as he looked at these signs of fierce struggle. "Egad," said he to himself, "old Scratch must have had a tough time of it." Tom consoled himself for the loss of his property with the loss of his wife. He was a man of fortitude. He even felt something like gratitude toward the black woodsman, whom he considered to have done him a kindness. He therefore tried to cultivate further acquaintance with him, but without success for some time. The old blacklegs played shy. Whatever people may think, he is not always to be had for the asking. He knows how to bide his time when confident of his prize. At length, it's said, when delay had sharpened Tom's desire and made him willing to agree to anything for the promised treasure, he met the black man one evening. The devil was dressed in his usual woodman's garb, axe on shoulder, sauntering along the swamp, humming a tune. He acted indifferent to Tom's advances, gave curt replies, and continued humming. Gradually, however, Tom brought him back to business, and they began to haggle over the terms by which Tom might claim the pirate's treasure. One condition, though not named, was clearly understood in all such deals, but there were others, less dramatic, but just as firmly insisted upon. The devil demanded that the money, once found, should be used in his service. He proposed that Tom invest in the black traffic, that is, to fit out a slave ship. Tom flatly refused. He was wicked enough, in all conscience, but not even the devil could tempt him to become a slave trader. Finding him squeamish on that score, the black man did not press the point, but instead proposed that Tom become a usurer, which means a moneylender. The devil had a particular fondness for usurers as his chosen people. To this suggestion, Tom raised no objection, for it suited him perfectly. "You shall open a broker's shop in Boston next month," said the black man. "I'll do it tomorrow, if you like," said Tom Walker. "You shall lend money at 2% a month." "Egad," said Tom, "I'll charge 4. "You shall extort bonds, foreclose mortgages, drive merchants to ruin." "I'll drive them to the devil," cried Tom Walker. "You are the usurer for my money," exclaimed the devil with glee. "When do you want the rhino?" "This very night," said Tom. "Done," said the devil. "Done then," echoed Tom Walker. They shook hands and struck the bargain. Within a few days, Tom Walker was installed behind a desk in a counting house in Boston. His reputation as a ready money man, willing to lend for a steep price, spread quickly. Everyone remembers the time of Governor Belcher when money was particularly tight. It was the era of paper credit. The land was flooded with government bills. The famous land bank had been founded. Speculation fever was rampant. People dreamed of new settlements and building cities in the wilderness. Land jobbers wandered about with maps of township and Eldorados that no one could locate, but everyone was eager to buy into. In short, the classic speculative frenzy had seized the country, and when it passed, as it always does, the dream faded and imaginary fortunes vanished. The people were left in misery, and the land rang with the cry of hard times. At this opportune moment of public distress, Tom Walker opened his usury business. His door was soon crowded. The needy, the reckless speculator, the land schemer, the bankrupt merchant, the ruined tradesman, all flocked to him. Tom was the universal friend in need, always demanding good pay and security. The more desperate the borrower, the harsher Tom's terms. He raked in bonds and mortgages, tightened the screws, and sent his victims away dry as a sponge. He grew rich fast, his fortune swelling hand over fist. He became a man of note and raised his cocked hat high on the Boston Exchange. Out of vanity, he built a vast house, but out of his miserliness, left much of it unfinished and unfurnished. He even set up a carriage, proud of his status, though he nearly starved the horses. As the dry wheels screeched on the ungreased axles, one might have thought they were wailing with the souls of the poor debtors he had wrung dry. As Tom aged, however, he became thoughtful. Having secured the good things of this life, he began to worry about the next. He regretted the deal he had struck with his black friend and set about trying to cheat him out of the bargain. All at once, Tom became a fervent churchgoer. He prayed loud and long, as though heaven might be stormed by sheer force of lungs. Indeed, his neighbors could tell how much he had sinned during the week by the volume of his Sunday prayers. The quiet Christians, long trudging steadfastly toward Zion, were made to feel ashamed at being overtaken by this new convert. Tom was just as rigid in religious matters as in his money-lending. He harshly judged and scolded his neighbors' sins, as if each one entered against their account might be credited to his. He even talked about reviving the persecution of Quakers and Anabaptists. In short, Tom's zeal became as notorious as his riches. Still, despite all his piety, Tom lived in fear that the devil would, after all, claim his due. To avoid being caught unprepared, he always carried a small Bible in his coat pocket. He also kept a great folio Bible on his counting-house desk and was often seen reading it when callers arrived. On such occasions, he would carefully lay his green spectacles between the pages to mark his place before turning to cut a usurious bargain. Let's take another break here. And so the story continues, with a rich man growing rich, then fearful, and trying, too late, to change. Later in life, Tom regrets, or rather he fears, and in his fear he turns not to repentance, but to ritual. He prays loud and long, he carries a Bible like a charm, but nothing changes inside him. His piety is performance, aimed not at God, but at the shadow that he knows is coming. This is not conversion, it's camouflage. Irving sees what's underneath, a man who still cuts cruel bargains, still crushes the poor, still refuses mercy. Tom doesn't want salvation, he wants safety. And this too is American, a country that often confuses faith with favor, morality with security. We wrap ourselves in signs of goodness, but live unchanged, as if, when the reckoning comes, we might talk our way out of it. But the devil takes no promises. He takes accounts, and in the end, the reckoning arrives, swift and final. Because, after all, it's not what we profess that tells our story. It's what we practice. Let's finish the tale. Some say Tom became slightly crack-brained in his later years. Believing the end near, he had his horse newly shod, saddled, and buried with its feet upward, figuring the world would be turned upside down at the last judgment. That way his horse would be ready to ride, and he'd give the devil a run for his money. But this, no doubt, is an old wives' tale. If he did take such precautions, they were entirely in vain, at least, so says the reliable old legend, which concludes his tale as follows. One hot summer afternoon, during the dog days, just as a terrible black thunderstorm was coming on, Tom sat in his counting house, wearing his white linen cap and India silk morning gown. He was about to foreclose a mortgage, one that would complete the ruin of an unlucky land speculator, a man Tom once claimed as a friend. The poor land jobber begged for just a few months' grace, but Tom, irritable and short-tempered, refused any further delay. "My family will be ruined and brought upon the parish," pleaded the land jobber. "Charity begins at home," replied Tom. "I must take care of myself in these hard times." "You've made so much money out of me," said the speculator. Tom lost both his patience and his piety. "The devil take me," said he, "if I've made even a farthing." Just then, 3 loud knocks sounded at the street door. Tom stepped out to see who it was. A black man stood holding a black horse, which neighed and stamped with restless energy. "Tom, you're come for," said the black fellow gruffly. Tom shrank back, but it was too late. He had left his little Bible at the bottom of his coat pocket, and his great folio Bible lay buried under the very mortgage he was about to foreclose. Never was a sinner caught more unprepared. The black man swept him up like a child into the saddle, gave the horse a lash, and away they galloped through the heart of the thunderstorm. The clerks in the office stuck their pens behind their ears and stared from the windows. Off dashed Tom Walker, his white cap bobbing, his morning gown flying behind him, and the horse striking sparks from the pavement with every bound. When the clerks turned to look again, the black man had vanished. Tom Walker never returned to foreclose the mortgage. A countryman, living on the edge of the swamp, later reported that during the height of the storm, he had heard a great clatter of hooves and a dreadful howling on the road. Running to his window, he caught sight of a figure, just as described, riding a horse that tore madly across the fields, over the hills, and down into the black hemlock swamp, headed straight for the old Indian fort. Shortly after, a bolt of lightning struck in that direction, and it seemed the whole forest caught fire. The good people of Boston shook their heads and shrugged their shoulders, but they had grown used to witches and goblins and the devil's tricks in every guise since the colony's earliest days, and so they were not as shocked as might be supposed. Trustees were appointed to take charge of Tom's estate, but there was nothing to take charge of. When they searched his coffers, they found all his bonds and mortgages reduced to cinders. In place of gold and silver, his iron chest was filled with nothing but chips and shavings. 2 skeletons lay in the stable where his half-starved horses had been, and the very next day, his grand house caught fire and burned to the ground. Such was the end of Tom Walker and his ill-gotten wealth. Let all grasping money brokers take this story to heart. The truth of it cannot be doubted. The very hole under the oak trees where he dug up Kidd's treasure is still visible today, and nearby, the swamp and old Indian fort are often haunted on stormy nights by a rider in a white cap and morning gown, surely the restless spirit of the usurer. Indeed, the tale has passed into legend and is the origin of that saying so common across New England, quote, "The devil and Tom Walker." And so it ends. Tom disappears into the storm, and the world moves on. His fortune vanishes, his house burns, and only a whisper remains, a caution repeated in taverns and told to children. Remember the devil and Tom Walker. This story is a warning, yes, but not of fire and brimstone. It's a warning about how easy it is to trade away soul for safety, about how, in a nation of contracts, we often forget that what we sign shapes who we become. So many American myths carry this tone, not to condemn, but to awaken, to remind us that we are a people of the covenant, not just the deal, that character is not found in wealth, but in witness, and that silence, too, is a kind of signature. Next time, we descend into a colder shadow, to the woods of the far north, where something ancient stalks the edge of firelight. The Wendigo is a tale not of bargains, but of hunger, a myth of winter, isolation, and the price of forgetting who we are. Until then, walk carefully, Not every deal is struck at a table, and not every signature is written in ink. Thank you for listening to New American Mythos. If these stories have stirred something in you, one of the best ways to support the show is by joining our community on Patreon. At the first tier, you'll receive early access to all episodes, plus 2 exclusive bonus episodes when the season concludes. That will be around the middle of November. At the second level, you'll get a special gift in December, a free copy of this season's separate audiobook project, our modernized recording of Washington Irving's Old Christmas. And for our top-tier patrons, you'll receive a signed, limited edition copy of the bound collection of Season 1 myths, a tangible piece of the world we're building together. A non-limited edition of this book will be available around December 15th for regular listeners to purchase. Your support really does keep the lantern lit and ensures these old stories can speak anew. Thank you for walking this road with us.